She's getting paid by U.S. taxpayers to organize riots in foreign countries, and she's simultaneously organizing them at home. We're plugging her into a giant network and giving her the money to organize mass riots to create this, while she is actively stoking that and organizing this at Tesla factories here in the United States. Do you understand? It's the same thing with Nina Jankowicz. It's the same thing with Dean Jackson. It's the same thing with all these Ned puppets, all these U.S. Institute of Peace puppets. It's this point that I've been trying to drive home lately so much, which is it's not just bad enough with what they're doing and how they're misspending the money and how destructive it is to our country. It's that we have funded these people, resourced them, trained them to have 10, 20, 30-year careers in how to destabilize a country in order to overthrow its government. And they took that same money network, those same network connections, and that same set of skills to topple our own. Unfucking believable. A full program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Getting a sense as to why they didn't want Doge or the federal government to have access to everything they were fucking doing at the U.S. Institute of Peace?
Nothing lasts forever, but be honest, babe. Hurts, but it may be the only way.
So, today we're doing a deep dive on the U.S. Institute of Peace. A good friend we all know and love at this point. But a refresher for folks who are new here. I've talked about the U.S. Institute of Peace in a variety of contexts. And we'll just start with some of the most flamboyant of these. So, one of the things that I was talking about a couple years ago was how strange it was that the U.S. Institute of Peace was simultaneously working in Afghanistan, doing conflict resolution, working with the Taliban tribes and the Afghan special forces and the indigenous community in Afghanistan, while telling the Taliban to keep 95% of the world's heroin supply flowing. They said the ban is not a counter-narcotics victory. It will have negative economic consequences. Banning heroin. Now, Afghanistan was, I believe, 95% of the world's heroin supply. 95% of the market in Europe. Inside the Taliban's war on drugs. They tried to reduce it by 95% after the U.S. military occupation. Now, this is not the first time the Taliban has tried to wipe out the heroin supply in Afghanistan. They did this in 2000. In June 2000, the Taliban banned opium in Afghanistan, which was then around 70% of global opium output. July 2000, this is 1 year before 9/11. This action resulted in a 99% reduction in poppy farming within Taliban-controlled areas. The ban was short-lived, however, due to the Taliban's overthrow. And it was under U.S. military occupation that opium came back, and it roared back to like 90% of the world's opium supply. Now, the Taliban originally were funded, back when they were the Mujahideen, they were funded. The drugs were used to fund the Mujahideen, the CIA's Islamic mercenary warrior force against the Soviets in Afghanistan. We've played this clip several times, but it's worth showing again. This is Zbigniew Brzezinski to the Mujahideen. When we were funding their drug networks, we were taking the opium on the Golden Crescent. We were using it as effectively development funds to fund the Mujahideen. We would traffic those drugs through the Turkish White Wolves, through the Albanian drug gangs who would later play a leading role in NATO's military war in Yugoslavia. We'd process them in France and we'd ship them from Italy. And this was the so-called pizza connection, the French connection. All of this was smuggling opium that started in Afghanistan. And here's Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter in 1979, dropping out of a helicopter to tell what today are the Taliban the following.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role.
He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role.
Border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed.
You
know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long
as possible. So the purpose is to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as possible. So we built up a giant drug network in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which neighbors it to the south. These are the roots, by the way, of the U.S. hold over Pakistan. And its ISI, its intelligence service, as well as its military, which effectively controls domestic politics in Pakistan. Now, this CIA drug running operation through the Mujahideen resulted eventually in the collapse of what at the time was, I think, the 7th largest bank in the world, BCCI, CIA Drugs. Okay, this is the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, laundering narcotics money for the CIA, for the Mujahideen. This was put up by a Pakistani frontman. And you'll see, like, this is all from the Justice Department, the world's sleaziest bank. Time magazine, BCCI, the dirtiest bank of all. As Time reported earlier this month, the National Security Council, which is the White House interagency on top of the CIA, the DOD, and the State Department, used BCCI to funnel money for the Iran-Contra deals. And the CIA maintained accounts for BCCI for covert operations. But the CIA may have used BCCI as more than an undercover banker. U.S. agents collaborated with the Black Network in several operations. Cozy relations with international terrorists. Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. Colombian drug barons. Laundering money for the drug trade. The arms business. Worked hand in hand with the drug cartels. BCCI became the regional magnet for drug money because it's very easy to convert it to clean cash when it's right next door. That's why they open up these local branches, like they did in Australia with Nugan Hand, and like they did in the Caribbean with the Cayman Islands, Castle Bank and Trust. All these were CIA proprietary banks. So what I'm trying to say here is this was a CIA, DOD, black market drug economy that was set up during the Cold War to support the Afghan warriors as they were fighting the Soviets, but then it became a lucrative, you want the link? But then it became a lucrative market unto itself. And people wonder, how is it that they get away with this? How is it that USAID, for example, could have been irrigating the poppy crops? USAID was funding the Afghan irrigation canals used in heroin production. And this comes straight from the U.S. Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. The watchdog established by Congress wrote in his quarterly report 6 years ago that actually USAID was keeping the drugs flowing. USAID was cultivating the poppy, growing it. And understand, USAID, USAID, and the U.S. Institute of Peace are part of a family. They operate together. In the U.S. Institute of Peace is sort of adjacent to NED in that originally you had the State Department, and that was what would do overt operations and some covert operations, but not much. There was basically two-track diplomacy stuff, but not really a bustling covert ops. That was done primarily through the military with the OSS in World War II and some of the early special operations before that. But there was never really organized until about 1948. The CIA was created as a plausible deniability layer for the State Department. And then USAID was created as a second plausible deniability layer for the CIA. And then NED and U.S. Institute of Peace were created as a plausible deniability layer a little bit below and sandwiched around so that USAID would not have to get its hands dirty for the dirtiest of things. It could be outsourced to a third party NGO who's not technically a part of the U.S. government, even though it was created by Congress, reports to Congress, and is funded entirely by the U.S. government. You understand? U.S. Institute of Peace is like Statecraft Blackwater, a sort of private military contractor who's funded and overseen by the U.S. government. But if Blackwater kills too many people in Fallujah, the U.S. government gets to say, damn, those private contractors. But it wasn't really us. We didn't authorize that. It's a way to create plausible deniability. So, given that the U.S. created the drug trade in Afghanistan, and that when the Taliban tried to get rid of it, the U.S. military descended on Afghanistan and took it over, was the start of the war in Afghanistan, October 2001. Because remember, we went to Afghanistan before we went into Iraq. October 2001. So the Taliban, which was responsible for 70% of the world's opium, reduced it by 99% in 2000. Just a year later, we militarily invade, and it skyrockets up to 90% of the world's opium. And you might wonder what mechanics are in place to do this. Isn't that supposed to be illegal? Isn't that what we hear every day from the FBI and the DEA that they're fighting against? Well, it's because they have little emissaries on the ground. They have networks that talk to the tribal leaders, that talk to the judges, that talk to members of the paramilitaries and extremist groups there. And among the most voracious of those, and the most celebrated of those, and the most infamous of those, is indeed, it's the U.S. Institute of Peace. And when the U.S. Institute of Peace is publicly saying, don't shut down the drugs, while they're working with those networks and funding those networks, that is as close as you can get to an open confession from the State Department, from the CIA, from the DOD, that they are the principal people responsible for and benefiting from the global trade in narcotics. Now, just quickly, what the Wikipedia will tell you. $55 million annual budget, formed in 1984, just 1 year. Remember, this was during the Reagan reforms. CIA gets in all this trouble in the 1960s and 70s, going after the left, going after the anti-Vietnam War left. CIA gets in big doo-doo during the Church Committee hearings in 1975 and 1976, holding up the heart attack gun, having to come clean about Operation Chaos, MK Ultra, Mockingbird. They're humiliated. 1977, Jimmy Carter fires 30% of the entire operations division of the CIA. Wants to do away with it entirely. 1979, the Iran hostage situation pops off. The national security community says, if we had only had the old CIA back, this would have never happened. Reagan gets to power. He wants to give the CIA its old powers back, but Democrats control the House of Representatives. And they say, no way, Jose. So Reagan gets creative. And he creates, by executive order and by essentially appealing to both sides of the aisle, he says, okay, we won't have the CIA do it. We'll create these new institutions at the NGO layer. And among those created were the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, in 1983, and the U.S. Institute of Peace in 1984. So you have to understand it belongs to that same coterie, that exact same coterie as NED, except it's really conflict zones is where it does the lion's share of its efforts. So see what the Wikipedia says. This is all about conflict resolution. Mediators. It provides research analysis and training to individuals in diplomacy. They're acting as essentially back-channel diplomats for the State Department, so that the U.S. Institute of Peace can have the much harder conversations with these various groups all over the world that the U.S. State Department does not necessarily want to deliver directly. The U.S. Institute of Peace can be meaner. It can be more threatening. It can say things that are more controversial. because it is not technically speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, but it represents the U.S. government to other countries. It is a plausibly deniable layer of diplomacy. Understand, that's called a back channel. For example, the name of Bill Burns' autobiography is, which I'm like halfway through reading right now, is The Back Channel. It's the head of the CIA under Joe Biden, 35 years of the State Department before that. And by the way, again, don't be fooled by that word peace. We've talked about this many times, but Bill Burns, who was Joe Biden's head of the CIA, what was he doing for 7 years before that? As we've gone over many times, he was the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. What qualifies you, pray tell, from running the Endowment for International Peace from 2015 to 2021? What qualifies you from running the International Peace NGO to running the Central Intelligence Agency? I think you guys know the answer, right? What they call peace is a state of complete control, stability. This is why you'll often see this peacekeeping work as being referred to as stabilization work. Stabilization is when we want to support a regime that's in power. Destabilization is what's done to undermine a regime that we want to topple. It's just the other side of the chessboard. It's dirty, dirty, dirty work. And somebody has to do the dirty work. Enter the U.S. Institute of Peace. Okay. The Institute is governed by a bipartisan board of directors. Bipartisan does not mean pro-Trump. It means the never-Trump wing of the GOP plus the Democrats. 15 members, which must include the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the President of National Defense University. The remaining 12 are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. So this little old fella here has to, by statute, has to have the Secretary of War and the Secretary of State on its board. Has to. As well as the President of the National Defense University. Funny, the U.S. Institute of Peace has to be chaired by the head of war, the head of the War Training Institute, and the State Department. But this is the way it's structured. It's right next to the it's right next to the State Department. And then it continues with the story that you guys may have seen, but we'll get to that story in a second here. And you'll see what it says here is without resorting to violence, without resorting to violence, without resorting to violence. You'll see this a lot in U.S. Institute of Peace documents. And a point I want to stress here is they're utterly full of shit when they say that. But you need to know how they're full of shit, because they will argue that what they're saying here is a true statement. And what I'm trying to communicate to you is a term that you will see all over U.S. Institute of Peace literature, as well as all over NED literature and State Department and USAID literature, is the concept of what they call nonviolent action. We've talked about this many times. Nonviolence means mob violence. In their conception of the word nonviolent, and this is the whole Gene Sharp thing, okay? Gene Sharp, nonviolent, here you go. 198 methods of nonviolent action. You can just look up all the Gene Sharp stuff. We've been over this article, which is fantastic on Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp was the theorist at the Harvard CIA, the Harvard Center for International Affairs, which was a cute acronym for the CIA's home site on Harvard campus. Got $50 million from the Pentagon to create a handy, helpful, scientifically backed methodology for organizing ground-up color revolutions, mobs of people, rather than a top-down military coup, a people-powered mob coup, rent-a-riots, okay? Nonviolent action means rent-a-riot, 100% of the time. So you'll see nonviolence, you see, this is the phrase. So that means organizing the communities. While we're at it, since the U.S. Institute of Peace was involved in this in Yugoslavia, we've gone over this documentary. I think it was Censorship Industry Annotated, Episode 4. See if I can scroll to find the U.S. Institute of Peace guy who trained them. Hold on a second. This is when the CIA had given $70 million to the Otpor movement to create... Here you go. Let's see. I think this is the guy right here. Now, this is the guy from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Daniel Serwer, Director, Balkans Initiative, U.S. Institute of Peace.
We, I don't know, said we are a people's movement, although we were just a bunch of students. But after that, we became a people's movement, and everyone came to us.
Otpor's recruiting strategy relies on shock therapy, the clenched fist, stormtrooper wardrobes.
The clenched fist, stormtrooper wardrobes. This is what they're calling nonviolence without resorting to violence. Clenched fist, stormtrooper wardrobes.
And black leather are intentionally sinister. It's
Intentionally sinister. Now, this is them bragging about this. Intentionally sinister. That's what nonviolence means. They're a street mob. And before I come back to this, 1340, I want to show you what the end stage, for folks who didn't watch this episode that we did, the end stage of this looks like this.
on this day, there is only one place to be.
This is what they call nonviolence. Surrounding the Parliament building to run the democratically elected leader of the country out. And you'll see what they end up doing is
Thousands of presidential ballot commanders
literally raiding the Capitol in actual January 6th, in actual insurrection, with money from the CIA, the State Department, training from the U.S. Institute of Peace, Pentagon advisors. This is what they refer to as nonviolent action.
never ordered their troops to fire because they knew their own kids were in that crowd. Inside the building, they find thousands of presidential ballots, pre-marked for Milosevic.
Notice they broke the glass, and they will begin setting the building on fire shortly.
Well, breaking the few windows and
They've set the Capitol building on fire. And they are calling this without recourse to violence. Nonviolent action. Nonviolent action. We'll see that a lot tonight. Now, what you understand, nonviolent to them just means, well, we didn't order the military to fire on them. It means BLM riots, Summer of Love 2020. Okay? Mostly peaceful arson. Right? Molotov cocktails in police cars. Yeah, sure, we may have killed a few police officers. Yeah, sucks what happened to David Dorn, but on the whole, while the fires around you engulf, and while they are intentionally sinister and breaking glass and getting in everyone's face, then if you push back, well, now you're cracking down on a peaceful assembly. International sanctions, everyone's cut off the SWIFT system to suffocate the regime out of power. And it relies on control over the media, which is why it's so important to control social media, as social media replaced traditional media. Because if the media only covered the crackdown, it didn't cover the violence, then the administration would look guilty. But this is what it looks like.
Parliament in flames, it's just nothing. In comparison to
the Parliament, they left the Parliament in flames. And that's what they call nonviolent action. So understand, the whole thing is a linguistic trick in order to fool the international community, in order to have the media print that phrase so that you are psychologically denied in some part of your brain what you see 6 inches in front of your face. Do not believe it for a second. In your head, every time you see nonviolence, swap mob violence. That's what it is. And someone needs to organize the mobsters to do the mob violence. By the way, this is why you see the unions all over this. The State Department in the unions, the Labor Department in the unions, the National Endowment for Democracy and the Solidarity Center in the unions, because of the unions and the mob.
former period here, to what Milosevic did here, to what other Balkan...
Lost in the takeover.
Wait, I want to just get to the U.S. Institute of Peace person here.
Heart attack suffered by an elderly man.
Now, this is the guy from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Let's go through his segments. 2314. Here you go.
He had faced down the NATO bully and survived.
Now, remember, this is the origins of NATO as an offensive weapon. In 1995, before the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, NATO had never fired a single bullet in the 49 years of its existence.
He didn't care how much damage his army suffered or his people suffered.
Daniel Serwer, Director, Balkans Initiative, U.S. Institute of Peace. This is who is on the ground training the Outpour movement in techniques of mob violence. Okay? That's how far back this goes. And you wonder why it is that the Secretary of War has to be on the U.S. Institute of Peace's board, as well as the Secretary of State, as well as the head of the National Defense University, because it's a military thing. They are organizing the paramilitary side of the U.S. military's agenda. Do you understand that? Through a civil society front, because there's another group that does that. It's the U.S. Special Forces from the military side. The U.S. Special Forces also engages in training and arming and organizing guerrilla movements and paramilitaries and rebel groups. But they're a military function. This is that equivalent from the State Department function, and they're funded by the State Department. They're a civil society side of special operations, effectively, and political warfare.
What he cared about was his own hold on power. The bombing, in the end, clearly strengthened his hold on power in the short term. It may have, in the longer term, undermined it. But the notion that he was going to worry about military damage is nonsense. He wasn't going to. But I heard many, many times in the State Department, he will only respond to force.
So that's when they organized the Rent-a-Riots. Spiral just pulled the Wikipedia for this guy. You'll see throughout this who are the groups that they're using as their frontline mercenaries for these street revolution movements inside of Yugoslavia. It was the Albanian narco-traffickers that had been working with the CIA and the U.S. Institute of Peace and the State Department for the whole drug trafficking operation out of Afghanistan from the 1970s. Oh, and look at that. Daniel Serwer is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. The exact place we covered on last week's stream and the week before that. Our past two streams have covered this exact place, which is located right next door to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Brookings. This was this video. These three CIA incubator vectors are all right next to each other on the same block in D.C. Brookings. Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They're literally all right next to each other on the same block, and they all do the same thing. They are civil society cutouts for the Central Intelligence Agency. They are State Department Blackwater. And so, of course, that's where he is now. If you do a good job, you get your sinecure at Brookings or Carnegie or the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. What else is he up to now? Middle East Institute, U.S. Department of State, Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Wow, right at the time the Italians were going after the Italian mafia. Special Envoy in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Vice Chair. Oh, so he got promoted. He went on to be Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Balkans. He specialized in interethnic conflict. We're going to get to that when we get into these. Author of Strengthening International Regimes, From War to Peace. Interesting. Oh yeah, by the way, Spiral sent me something on Beryl Howe. I have the Beryl Howe stuff flagged. Should I do that real quick right now? Yeah, let me jump to it right now. Spiral found this, which is insane. That Beryl Howe used to be on the board of directors of the Center for Democracy and Technology. I think it was like 15 years ago or something, right? This is the judge who just forced the reinstatement of the U.S. Institute of Peace. We'll get to that part of the story in a second. But you have to understand, CDT is just another one of these same blob CIA State Department conduits, just like Carnegie, just like Johns Hopkins, SAIS, just like the Harvard Belfer Center, just like Brookings. I'm going to show you something real quick. This is a piece that I wrote. Here it is. So I wrote this piece, The Censorship Industry's 2024 Election Censorship Blueprint, in December of 2023. And what I went over here was a September 2023 report by the place Beryl Howell, the corrupt judge who just forced the reinstatement of the U.S. Institute of Peace after a showdown with the... I'll tell that whole story in a second here. But after all of the high drama, what you'll see here in this report is a literal blueprint for how best to censor the internet ahead of the 2024 elections. Written by Dean Jackson, who's at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace under Bill Burns, and then Bill Burns became the head of the CIA. And before that, Dean Jackson was at the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, Dean Jackson would go on to write, when Brazil banned X and seized assets from Starlink because Elon was refusing to censor what the corrupt Voldemort judge wanted in Brazil, Elon Musk, malign threat, democracy, proximal threat. In the height of that drama, the State Department doing nothing to protect a U.S. national champion, X and Starlink, from having assets seized by a foreign government. Dean Jackson, who authored that from the Center for Democracy and Technology, wrote Elon Musk's malign influence in Brazil. And what he writes there is that Musk is arguably a more proximate threat to Brazilian and American democracy than the Putinist or Chinese communist regimes. So we pay Dean Jackson as taxpayers to develop these dark arts skills to manipulate foreign countries, to manipulate their media, their voters, their parliament members, their judges. He is a part of that same blob stew in the NGO sphere funded by the State Department and USAID that Nina Jankowicz crawled out of. But their mission, we pay them to take on Russia, to take on China. But what do they actually say they're doing? They're taking on U.S. citizens. And that Musk is actually a bigger threat to both Brazilian and American democracy than either the Putinist or CCP regimes in Russia or China. This is the Center for Democracy and Technology that Beryl Howell was evidently on the board of directors. Now, I guess this was 2008, so it's been a long time. Doesn't mean that she's responsible for that. That was 15 years after her tenure, evidently. But that is what that institution represents. And you'll see the thing they were complaining about is that Elon has frustrated relationships with counter-disinformation professionals. Since Elon's purchase of Twitter, that company's been at the forefront of these trends. Its cuts and reversals are often imitated later by other companies, meaning that's what Mark Zuckerberg started doing at Facebook and Instagram. This is why it did not surprise me when Mark Zuckerberg came out with what he said, that he wanted to go back to free speech, because CDT was complaining about it a year before. The problem is especially acute at Twitter. Just a week after his acquisition, he laid off 3,700 employees. 15% of the trust and safety team was cut, including ones focused on human rights and global conflict. The U.S. Institute of Peace was eliminated entirely. This is where I grabbed that clip from of the EU Digital Censorship Act.
If it weren't for Europe right now, I think that I would feel pretty defeated and despondent in this moment. It has certainly become much, much more difficult for outside researchers to do the sorts of the options that you list, Samir, to actually engage directly with people at the platforms, because there are simply fewer of them, right? We spent literally years building up relationships with good folks
with good censors. Now, this is Dean Jackson right here. This is the CDT launch report. This is where I pulled this from. The Center for Democracy and Technology, right? The Center for Blob Control Using Technology. That's what that's translated as. This is Dean Jackson. Right next to her, this is Rebecca Tremblay, who ran Toxic Conversations from Trust and Safety at Twitter 1.0. This is Dean Jackson, who wrote that lead author of this report, and Carnegie and National Endowment for Democracy. And this is Katie Harbath, who I believe is currently on the board of directors for CDT. Beryl Howell's, the corrupt judges, where she used to be on the board. Now Katie Harbath is on the board of this. Katie Harbath is one of the worst in this entire space. Involved in everything from the whole Stanford Internet Observatory Network. She was a part of IRI at the National Endowment for Democracy. She's at the Atlantic Council with 7 CIA directors on its board and annual funding for the Pentagon, State Department, USAID. She runs this thing called Anchor Change, which is a big censorship advocacy nonprofit. And she was formerly, I believe, head of government affairs at Facebook. So technology and then all these like CIA intermediary groups. This is who's censoring the internet. And they were upset that all these changes were happening, with Elon and Mark Zuckerberg bringing free speech back to the platforms, and Republicans finally taking action in Congress against government censorship. And they said, thank God, though, Europe's censorship laws will save us.
Platforms who are trying to do the right thing. And for the most part, they're gone, right? It's really, really difficult to know who to reach out to, who to work with. If it weren't for the European Union and the Digital Services Act, I don't know that we'd have much hope of rectifying that situation at all. But given the sort of requirements that for performing risk assessments, for sharing more transparent information with the public, and crucially for sharing data with researchers.
Operatives, censorship operatives.
I do think that we still have some options for leverage to continue the work that we've been doing. And hopefully, ultimately, that leads to a sort of restaffing of some of these positions, increased focus again, as the DSA begins to come into force and the platforms feel the real pressure of actual enforcement action.
So these are all U.S. censors at the place Judge Beryl Howell, who just reinstituted over the president the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is supposed to be picked, its board members are supposed to be picked by the president. And what they say is, we would be desperate and depressed if not for a foreign country's censorship laws that we will leverage to get our censorship jobs back here in the U.S. Because as X and Facebook and Instagram feel the real pressure of enforcement from a foreign fucking body, the U.S. censors in exile will get their power back by teaming up with a foreign government using censorship powers that are barred here in the U.S. by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. If that doesn't make your blood boil, you are either a lizard or you're dead. All right, let's get back to the U.S. Institute of Peace. But again, Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, it's the same linguistic fuckery. All right, I want to play a couple more scenes of the U.S. Institute of Peace from that documentary we were just replaying some of.
That was best gained through democratic forces within Serbia. And
so what he's saying is, like, listen to this, okay?
There is no doubt he's finished. The people have taken power.
With violence, with mob violence, organized discreetly by the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Central Intelligence Agency, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and all their little allies at Carnegie and Brookings and Atlantic Council and all these places.
What we needed the whole time was not the threat or use of force.
Listen to that bullshit. As the fucking building is on fire, we're at 52, 53, cracked windows. So as the Parliament building is lit on fire, I just want to make sure that is perfectly clear to you so that you can understand how the U.S. Institute of Peace is lying publicly about the kind of stuff they do.
The people have taken power.
What we needed the whole time was not the threat or use of force.
Not the threat or use of force? You've set the Parliament building on fire. What he means is we didn't need to spend $20 billion on Tomahawk missiles and cruise missiles. We could do it for $200 million by organizing Rent-a-Riots and having mob violence. That's what they mean by that. And they consider that to be a humanitarian resolution of the conflict. Endless BLM, and again, BLM gets its clenched fist from this exact U.S. Institute of Peace, CIA, State Department bullshit, the Canvas movement. Look up Canvas, C-A-N-V-A-S, and look at the 25 different countries where they put the raised fist, and look at their involvement in all the 2020 shit. It's eye-popping. It's a direct match. But he's lying to you when he says this. It was absolutely the threat of force. Because they didn't win at the ballot box. They had trouble organizing and all picking on one particular person to prop up as the new leader. Because the Albanians and the Kosovars and the Serbs, the whole ethnic soup, a lot of them didn't like each other. They weren't winning at the ballot box. They won through the use of force, through street terrorism.
It was the threat to his hold on power, and that was best gained through democratic forces within Serbia.
Democratic forces within Serbia. Funny, your previous sentence was, it was not achieved through the use of force. It was achieved through the use of democratic forces. Hey, you're not wrong about that part. They were fucking forces, because they were using force. Mike, do you suspect the supposedly fraudulent ballots they found might have been planted BS? It just seems a little convenient. Yes. I highly suspect that. They probably had some Ned operative with a messenger bike bag, or like a dozen of them, so that when they went into the building, they could throw them out. Did anyone ever even check that? See, when they controlled the media in the 1990s, and there was no social media, there was no on-the-ground reporting. Everything you saw was from CNN or NBC or ABC or Voice of America. In this case, it's going to come from CI proprietary media outlets like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and Voice of America. That's who's going to report this. What do you think they're going to report? Did you see the slips? Could you make out the writing on it of what it said?
And, the grand lesson here is that broad-based coalition of popular nonviolent protest.
Broad-based rent-a-riots and mob violence
can sweep away a dictatorship.
Can overthrow a government.
Much more quickly than all the covert action on Earth.
No, it was absolutely covert. It was absolutely covert. And they even talk about it throughout this, how they had to hide their sources of foreign funding, how it only came out afterwards they had received like $72 million from the U.S. government. This is why the U.S. Institute of Peace and NED and all these groups are up in arms when countries like Hungary try to pass these FARA-like bills about foreign funding laws. Hungary proposes controversial Russia-style legislation to investigate foreign-funded organizations. They proposed a bill titled Transparency in Public Life, so that if you're funded by a foreign NGO, you have to tell the government. We have that in the U.S. It's called FARA, the Foreign Agent Registrations Act. Nina Jankovic had to file that, a FARA registration, for the UK when she was funded by the UK's Centre for Information Resilience after working at the DHS Disinformation Governance Board. But what happened in Hungary and what happened in Serbia, for example? Serbia Foreign Funding Transparency Act. The EU crammed down on them. There were riots in the streets from the same USAID, U.S. Institute of Peace, NED networks. Their law on foreign agents risks democratic and EU integration goals. It's covert. Serbia, Slovakia, Hungary all tried to pass laws requiring overt disclosure of foreign funding. And what happened? NED and U.S. Institute of Peace and all these USAID networks literally organized riots on the streets and threats of getting cut off from the EU funding apparatus if people had to know the covert sources of funding coming from the U.S. and the EU in their home countries. Do you get that? Do you get how everything this man is telling you is a lie with a smile? Street protests, Serbia, foreign agents protests. From Euronews, protesters in Slovakia rally against legislation they say could harm NGOs' work. Oh yeah, the people in Czech's notes, Slovakia, just love not being able to know where the NGOs that operate in their country get their fucking money from. Think about that. How could you possibly be a patriot of your own country and not want to know where money from foreign sources are coming into your country? The same thing, right? They make pictures of kissing Putin. Why do you think they called it Russian to want to know where foreign funding is coming into Slovakia? You think that money is coming in from Russia if the country passes a law to require covert sources of funding become overt? You think it's going to reveal a lot of Russian money flowing into Slovakia? You think that's why they say Putin wants you to pass this law? No, dumbass. Not you guys. The proverbial dumbass on the other side of this. It's because it will reveal USAID and State Department and German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and UK Foreign Office and French Ministry of Foreign Affairs money. And they know that if that money, that covert money, has to be made overt, the people in Slovakia will be fucking pissed about the goddamn USAID Truman Show they've been living under for the past 30 years. And that will make them resent foreign interference from the United States and from places in the EU, and it will make them more sympathetic towards the Russians. That's why. I mean, imagine people on the streets saying, no, I have to not know where foreign money is flowing into my country. I demand I not be able to know where money from the US and Russia and France, and because it's not country specific, it's just foreign funds. They organized these same riots the same way they did in Yugoslavia. It was the threat of force. People on the streets, angry, menacing, sinister, confronting police, shutting down highways. Nonviolence, in the parlance of the blob's dialect, means mob violence. Okay. Now, with that said, let's get up to the present day here. Maybe a little bit of music first. I'm going to catch up on the chat and organize some notes. And maybe eat some pizza if you see me go dark.
We can remember swimming in December, heading for the city lights. 975, sharing each other, nearer than farther. Scent of lemon drips from your eyes. We are the people that rule the world, fussing in every boy and girl. Rejoicing in the world, take me now.
It's a great song. All right. Alrighty then. So, how you guys doing in the chat? Anybody got any funny stories? Lighten the mood a little, right? We are going to get academic in a little bit here. How many in Congress know about, understand, and or direct these activities around the world? Joe Biden certainly knew all about it. Joe Biden was egging it on, telling these places like the UN Institute of Peace that they weren't doing enough when Joe Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 20 years. You can see all sorts of, if you look up Joe Biden's Senate record on the Yugoslavia situation, he was proposing more money to give the Otpor movement fax machines and teach them how to use the early internet to set up static web pages and to train and do all this stuff. I think Marco Rubio knows this stuff. Marco Rubio was the head of the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or the ranking member, I think, during the last session. I would say the key people do. Mark Warner on the Democrat side will know this. If you're number one or number two on the Intel Committee or on the Senate Foreign Relations or House Foreign Affairs Committee, you know this stuff. You might not know all the nitty-gritty details, but you'll have a side eye. Does that make sense? Again, a lot of this I think will surprise even people at that chairman level because they support the end goal. They don't necessarily want to review and be in the know about how the sausage is made. They know their donors want sausage. And they know that these programs are connected to that sausage-making process. But a lot of times they're also blocked from oversight. We saw this with USAID blocking Senate oversight. I've talked to a lot of congressmen who had no clue about this, even ones who are on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But they're also not focused on this particular side of it. You know, they're focused on countering China, or they're focused on Venezuela, or they're focused on some oil country, and they're not necessarily keyed into the details of the networks in the democracy promotion sphere. Does that make sense? All right, so let's get up to speed on what happened. So start with this post here. I wrote a little over 2 months ago, high drama today at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the belly of secrets attached to the State Department. What had happened was Trump had purged the U.S. Institute of Peace. Doge, FBI, and police escort new leadership in takeover. The Trump administration removed 11 U.S. Institute of Peace board members, installing Kenneth Jackson as acting president with support from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as is required by statute. Doge arrived with FBI agents, but U.S. Institute of Peace's lawyers initially blocked them. D.C. police had to escort the new president of the institution inside. U.S. Institute of Peace's old leadership refused access and even tried hiring private security, I presume that says. The former president refused access, tried to fire the security team. U.S. Institute of Peace officials claim they're an independent agency outside executive branch control, even though it was created by the executive branch as overseen by Congress, and called the police to stop trespassing by the U.S. federal government. So all their money comes from the government. They report to the government. The government has to pick the entire board under statute. And it got even crazier. Let me see if I can showdown USIP March 2025. The judge blocked it initially, and then we won, and then we just lost again. This week's standoff. What's funny is they say that they are not a federal agency, but they're listed as a federal agency in federal agency documents, which is also funny. Okay. Was it George Moose? Was that the guy? I think his name is Moose, right? Yeah, George Moose. I'm curious to look more into George Moose, by the way. Anyway, there was this big standoff. Elon and Doge said that they had I have a great post on this where I write it up. But they locked the doors. They found weapons caches in the U.S. Institute of Peace. They then tried to delete a terabyte of data on their internal servers so that the federal government couldn't get access to it. They had a $130,000 contract with a former member of the Taliban, deleted a 1 terabyte of accounting records. Their accountant tried to delete this, funded Taliban and Iraqi leaders. They gave $1.3 million to the youth mobilization. Again, this is all for the street protests and the paramilitary. Elon, they tried to delete Taliban funding records. Doge recovered it. A terabyte of financial data tied to groups in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, so then what just happened today? So today, first I think Beryl Howell did an injunction, and then we overcame that injunction, and now there's a new injunction. And you'll see, so this is on USA.gov under U.S. government departments and agencies. U.S. Institute of Peace is listed as a U.S. government department and agency, just as it was in military documents, as we saw when we went over this a few weeks ago. But all right, so back to what's happened. Judge rules that Trump administration takeover of Institute of Peace is illegal. Judge Beryl Howell of the Blob CDT, a U.S. District Court in Washington, said the admin, in a gross usurpation of power, had acted with blunt force. It wasn't blunt force, it was democratic forces. We were using a people-powered revolution, guys. We didn't have to use force. We created a mob, and we stormed the building with a mob. Isn't that what you said democracy is? Against the independent agency. There's nothing independent about it. It's not independent of government money. It's not independent of government oversight. It's not independent of the government picking its fucking board of directors. But again, they want to try to paint this picture because when they say independent, it means independent from you, not from them. Just like independent media does not mean it's independent, genuinely independent. It means it's independent from you. You have no control over it. They do. Just like independent judges means independent from you, completely dependent on and influenced by them. So you know, whenever you see independent, it's one of these adjectives they throw in there. It means completely dependent on them and beholden to them. Federal judge ruled on Monday that the Trump admin's takeover and gutting of the U.S. Institute of Peace, an independent nonprofit. Serial liars. They stack lie on top of lie. Created by Congress to seek diplomatic solutions to global conflicts. You know, the State Department is supposed to have a monopoly on diplomacy. Everything the State Department funds, or USAID funds, is to advance diplomatic solutions proposed by the State Department. You're not allowed to have independent diplomacy. That's why the Secretary of State is a mandatory position on your board. You only get your money to influence the course of foreign events because you are helping the State Department's foreign policy vision. You're not allowed to be independent. You literally could not exist if you were independent. The March takeover and subsequent termination of most of their workforce followed an executive order from Trump, cutting its staff to a bare minimum. Judge Howell wrote that such changes require the consent of Congress, but the Trump admin had removed the institute's leadership and installed hand-picked replacements through blunt force, backed up by law enforcement officers. Yeah, because they had guns inside and were entitled to that damn building. Again, these are political appointments. Trump can put the political appointments in. They can be acting before the Senate confirmed. Judge Howell's ruling was the latest judicial order to block their efforts to assert power over Washington institutions. They're government institutions. By by the president's attempt to actually have control over the executive branch he was voted democratically by the people to have control over. Okay, White House spokesman called it rogue. Takeover unfolded over several dramatic days at the Institute. After confrontation lasting hours, their top staff, including its acting president, was evicted. They fired all 10 voting members on the organization's board. Hundreds of workers were terminated. Their work has since ground to a halt. Judge Howell rejected the Trump administration's arguments that the Institute was part of the executive branch, even though it's on USA.gov and has been for a decade as a U.S. government agency. Instead, she wrote, no, it supports the executive and legislative branches as an independent think tank that carries out its international peace. Okay, so what happens when the executive branch says, actually, you're not supporting us, you're undermining us? What happens if they're actively undermining the executive branch and they're no longer fulfilling their mission? Then what the fuck are you doing there? You're not doing your mission. Prohibits the admin's further trespass. George Foote, a former lawyer who helped bring the lawsuit. I wonder what this guy's about. Let's see. I wonder if this lawyer is connected to any drug cases. I wonder if it's like when Jeffrey Epstein loaned his State Department. You guys remember this? We've been over this. Jeffrey Epstein, State Department, pizza connection, French connection, lawyer. Guys remember when Jeffrey Epstein rented out the second largest residential building in New York City directly from the U.S. State Department? And then he subleased it out to a lawyer for the French connection heroin ring. And I believe the guy was also involved in the pizza connection, the mafia laundering of drug proceeds on the Eastern Seaboard. This is different from Pizzagate. This was called the Pizza Connection. You can look this up online. You know, any one of these will get you there. Let's just look up a couple of these characters. George Foote, U.S. Institute Peace. Let's look up this guy real quick. George Foote. Looks like a British banker type guy. Georgetown. All right. He was the outside general counsel to the U.S. Institute of Peace for more than 3 decades. 30 years. Imagine the shit this guy has seen with everything the U.S. Institute of Peace is doing. Paramilitaries, drug runners, smugglers, black market shit, regime change. Imagine being the lawyer for all that. This is the Better Call Saul for the blob. More than 3 decades as outside general counsel. He helped create Peace Tech Lab, a nonprofit corporation. How does that work? How are you a nonprofit and a corporation? I guess like structuring it as an LLC. Limited liability. That's a company. Corporation is usually like a S or a C. Dedicated to using technology, data, and media for blobcraft. It's like social media, Peace Tech Lab. He advises NGOs on treasury sanctions and terrorist organizations. Wireless Industry Trade Association, AT&T and all that. That's funny. Isn't that amazing? Wait, stop. Don't move. Wow. Yeah, so it is. So there it is. A telecoms contract for Syria for the U.S. provider AT&T. Why do you guys think in the chat that I spent so much time pulling that up? Who can connect the dots? Why is this some sort of big reveal that I wasted 5 minutes of our lives corroborating? This week is when this is. U.S. lifts sanctions on Syria, and now AT&T will be Syria's wireless provider instead of Huawei from China. Well, it's because look at who the outside lawyer is. This very guy who sued and got the U.S. Institute of Peace reinstated. 3 decades at the U.S. Institute of Peace. What does he do in his side gig? His side gig is that he also represents the Wireless Industry Trade Association. He represents wireless carriers. Who's the biggest wireless carrier? AT&T. The U.S. Institute of Peace is ass deep, knee deep, elbow deep, skull deep, go gadget, fucking extract an arm 30 feet out deep in Syria, working with the Syrian terrorist groups, working with the Syrian rebel militaries, the conflict zone of Syria. So while U.S. Institute of Peace is working to overthrow the Assad government, he's simultaneously representing the wireless carriers that will make all of the profits after the government is overthrown. Do you get that? So, U.S. Institute of Peace, while he's advising the U.S. Institute of Peace to work with all over Syria, like watch this, U.S. Institute of Peace, Syria. They're all over Syria. Okay, archive.org. They're all over it. Let's go, for example, we'll just pick a random date. They were all over it, all through the CIA's Operation Temper Sycamore here. The current situation in Syria. U.S. Institutes of Peace. Work. We've been working in Syria since the war began in 2011. They were there a lot longer before that. But since the start of the war, we've been there. We have supported local leaders. We have supported local leaders. They're working directly with the rebel groups' leaders, the moderate rebels, the terrorist groups in Syria, as well as international NGOs and civil society. Working with a Syrian local partner, we undertake local-level, outcome-oriented dialogues in northeast Syria. You know northeast Syria? The exact site of the U.S.-backed terrorists? You know what's happening in Syria here? Los Angeles Times. In Syria, this is in 2016, 5 years into that war. In Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. So maybe that's the kind of conflict resolution that U.S. Institute of Peace was doing in Idlib. Because that's what they do. They straddle the line between DOD and CIA. So maybe that's the peacekeeping. They were mediating the conflict between the CIA and the fucking Pentagon. Let's get back to this real quick. In partnership with the local Syrian organization. Interesting they don't name the organization. Aren't you supposed to be overt? You don't want to dox, huh? You don't want to dox them to their community that they're secretly working with the U.S. government? Oh, I'm sorry, an independent NGO funded entirely by the U.S. government that has to report to the U.S. government. The U.S. government picks their senior leadership. U.S. Institute of Peace allied tensions among Kurds and Arabs and between the two communities. Yes, in order to get them both to kill the Assad regime. This is like saying they did, like U.S. Institute of Peace was doing peacekeeping in Yugoslavia, allaying tensions among the Kosovars and the Albanians. That wasn't for peace. That was so that both pawns on the CIA chessboard would attack the right opponent. They'd make peace between themselves so that they would kill the State Department's enemies instead of each other. Combined reach, 60 plus villages and towns, 20 plus religious, civic, and tribal leaders. And then, as soon as they overthrow the government as part of the sanctions relief, they get negotiated a fat fucking telecom deal. What's the population of Syria? So AT&T just got 25 million new customers. You wonder why it is that these big multinational corporations support USAID and are members of places like the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition that pressures Congress to give USAID more money? It's because that's how they get fat fucking contracts. That's how they get captured markets. And if you're good to them, you'll end up representing them in a trade association or on one of their board of directors as you make your way up within the government side of the blob. You get that? All right. Save a whole PDF here. This looks fun. Is there anything else more about this lawyer? Telecom. How funny is that? Represents a major European defense manufacturer. Oh, he's a military contractor too. Boy, these Institute of Peace guys seem to love war. I represent weapons manufacturers. I represent killing technology. Yeah, that sounds like the guy that we should put in charge of peace. I wonder what other boards he served. Has he served? Is he connected to Chevron? I wonder. Numerous boards. I want like a full bio of this guy. Let's see. George Foote. Okay, you guys are sending some links. Hold on a second. Oh yeah, Mike Rogers. No fucking way. Mike Rogers. That was the guy that they were going to be putting up as the instead of cash at FBI, right? FBI special agent, Army officer. He chaired the Intelligence Committee. So the head of the Intelligence Committee in Congress, overseeing the 17 intelligence agencies, $70 billion budget, the chairman. He served as the chief security advisor to AT&T. Oh, and also MITRE. Again, the blob is the battering ram, the inner guts of it. The DOD, the CIA, the State Department, they're a battering ram for the donor drafter class. And AT&T is part of the donor drafter class. As are most multinational corporations. That's how you win in an international market, is the national governments take action on your behalf to capture the markets for you. Deliberative Tech and oh, this is the Kroc Institute. Keith Kroc. It's my old boss. I like Keith. Keith's a really good guy. He was very good to me. Afghanistan Peace and Development. Is that Maria Ressa? Dude, that's Maria Ressa. That's definitely Maria Ressa. Yeah, it is. No! That's my face looking at this, of course. Deliberative Technologies. Wow. Let's see. Oh, Jesus. Okay. Polarized context. That's us. We're the polarized people because we disagree with them. I don't even want to go down this rabbit hole right now. We got to stick to it. All right. Let's get back to it. Peace Tech and Polarization Lab. Jesus Christ. It's really part of the Kroc Institute. That makes me so sad. Social cohesion. You know, all this stuff is aimed straight at us. Social cohesion exists as a field because Trump won in 2016 and Brexit happened and Bolsonaro won and Modi got reelected and Matteo Salvini won in Italy and Marine Le Pen almost won in France. Social cohesion as a field presupposes that society is coming unglued because populism is polarizing people from each other because they disagree with the New York Times from the right and the left. So it's like social cohesion is like bringing people back into the uniparty consensus so that democracy doesn't really matter because everyone has the same opinion. That's why there are NATO social cohesion funds for this shit. NATO social cohesion. Social cohesion within democracies. Social cohesion. If people vote the wrong way, they're said to be undoing social cohesion. So this guy is basically just like, how do we get them all mind raped so that no one disagrees and there's no threats to social cohesion? Okay, this is the Peace Tech Lab, Afghanistan, Sudan, blah, 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 blah. Okay, all right, let's look up. Wow, George Foote has been their outside general counsel since 1986. It was only created in 1984, so this dude is like the keeper of all the secrets. Their top lawyer since pretty much the day they formed. That's crazy. Let's check out George Moose. George Moose, U.S. Institute of Peace. I want to check out his bio. Elliott School of International Affairs at GW, George Washington University, which is another one of these sort of a second rate. GWU actually gets more censorship funding, I think, than any other, or it did from the National Science Foundation. It got more funding for censorship contract work than any other university in the country. American Academy of Diplomacy, George Moose. He was Assistant Secretary for African Affairs So that is the head of the whole Africa desk in 1993 under the Clintons. A career member of the U.S. Foreign Service. Okay, so he was in the State Department his whole career. Ambassador to Benin and Senegal. Started in the State Department in 1967. It's 2025. 55 years this guy's been in the blob. The president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Oh, he's a political officer? Okay, so that's CIA. Barbados is a political officer. Vietnam in the Refugee Advisor Program as a political officer, 1969 to 71, that's fucking CIA. Political affairs, that's CIA. Council on Foreign Relations, that's CIA. Special advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. So the whole thing is the political branch, the political branch, the political branch. Why am I bringing that up, guys? Who can tell me in the chat what proportion of political officers are CIA at state? And this guy worked at like 7 different political branches. You guys remember this? This is from the JFK files, titled CIA Reorganization, Arthur Schlesinger's memo to President JFK to reorganize the CIA. Controlled American sources represent a particular aspect of CIA's encroachment on State Department policymaking functions. CIA today has nearly as many people under official cover overseas at state, 3,900 to 3,700. About 1,500 of these are under State Department cover. The other 2,200 are presumably under military or non-state official cover. In some missions, CIA personnel under State Department cover, that's what CIS is, CIA personnel under State Department cover outnumbers regular State Department personnel. In the American Embassy in Vienna, out of the 20 persons listed in the Foreign Service list as being in the political section, 16 of them are State Department are CIA under State Department cover. So the official registry says there's 20 people, State Department people, in the political section of the State Department. But actually, 16 of them are actually CIA working out of the embassy under State Department cover. 16 out of 20 in the political section. Of the 13 officers listed in the political section in their embassy in Chile, 11 of them are actually CIA, faking to the world that they're State Department, but they're actually secretly working for the CIA using the State Department as cover. 11 out of 13, 16 out of 20. On the day of President Kennedy's inauguration, 47% of the political officers serving in U.S. embassies around the world were secretly working for the CIA, not really working at the State Department like they were listed, but using their State Department position as official cover, diplomatic cover. 47% worldwide. In France, it's 10-2 CIA to state. So what are the odds? If the number is 47%, George Moose, who could do the conditional probability on this? Let's go back to George Moose's bio here. And of course, who was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs under Joe Biden? Victoria Nuland. So he was in how many political, he was a political officer in Barbados, that's 1. Political officer in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, that's 2. Political affairs to the UN, that's 3. Special advisor to the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, that's the advisor to the head of it. Victoria Nuland was the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, the head of that. Political in Rhodesia is 4. Bureau of Intelligence and Research, it's like 5. He speaks Vietnamese and French. So what's the conditional probability of 47%? A die rolled 5 times. You don't think any of those were CAS? So let's find out a little bit more about George Moose. Institute of Politics at Harvard. Career ambassador. Conversation with, okay. Let's check some of these out.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good trouble.
Everyone.
Good trouble.
Everyone.
Wait.
Good afternoon.
Wait, I just got done explaining how what these guys do is organize rent-a-riots. And the first video I pull up from June of last year, the name of the talk is called Good Trouble. No. PeaceCon 2024. Let's check this out. Corporate Affairs. American Express. Oh, I love it. Okay. So this is their PeaceCon 2024. They got the NGO, the U.S. government adjunct, U.S. Institute of Peace, and then we have Strategy and Operations, Corporate Affairs for American Express. Now understand, American Express is another one of these, the major credit card company, DIA USAID, that captured the market for Ukraine, because American Express does the same thing, where they capture these giant fat government contracts in foreign countries using the battering ram of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. aid and CIA shit to make that happen. So, for example, this DIA app, the state in a smartphone. At this event on the DIA Digital ID app, I asked Ukraine's ambassador about her government promoting itself as a laboratory for predatory surveillance tech. This is the state in a smartphone. I think Anya Parampil did a fantastic throw on this. Kiev officials and Samantha Power from USAID, the head of USAID. Kiev officials and Samantha Power from USAID are in D.C. celebrating how the Ukraine war kicked off a new age of e-governance. Alongside the executive chairman of Visa, this event is dedicated to promoting DIA, Ukraine's state in a smartphone that digitizes med records, banking, biometric data, all into a single app. They have a great piece on this. U.S. taxpayers funded DIA's development at USAID. Visa executive chairman boasts DIA also offered financial incentives for Ukrainians to get vaccinated. And last year, Ukraine awarded its National Peace Prize to Visa's incoming CEO. And then they turn around and they capture the, 50 million market in Ukraine? Or what's the population of Ukraine? I should know this. Yeah. 40 million. So Visa just locked up 40 million customers because USAID forced the government of Ukraine, using the leverage of USAID, to have all of their credit card transactions processed through this DIA app that Visa is locked in, same way AT&T locked in the wireless market in Syria. Visa, with USAID, locked in, and Google locked in the backbone for it. So Amex, I guess, wants to get in on it. So it's a U.S. Institute of Peace and American Express. But we're getting a little far afoot. At 2.5 hours in, let's get to the main focus of today's material, which is I wanted to go through the white papers. Let me tell you what we're about to do for the next hour. We're going to run through this. So what I have here, Spiral. So he found this link here of 678 different research reports in JSTOR from the U.S. Institute of Peace. So these are all white papers that were produced by the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I want to go through them so that we can look at a U.S. Institute of Peace eye view of the world. It's in alphabetical order here. You see, these go back to the 1990s, 1998, all the way up through 2024. It's just huge, the amount of ink they have spilled on this. But I want to pick out a couple of these. Like, for example, you'll see 2021, From the Street to the Peace Table, Nonviolent Mob Violence Mobilization During Interstate Peace Process. You see there are all these really interesting topics about all the little pivot points that they can use. Let me just read over some of these titles. It's just the stuff that I thought was interesting. From the Streets to the Peace Table, Nonviolent Mobilization, so mob violence, organizing riots during peace talks. Does it help us at the negotiating table when we have riots brewing in the background that destabilize our adversaries? Spoiler alert, yes. We literally saw this in the Mark Milley simulation that I went over about how they'll deliberately organize riots in the backgrounds of talks in Africa. We saw that for Special Operations, the Fort Bragg Information Warfare Center with the USA Job Fairs. I thought this one is interesting. The Green Diamond, Coffee and Conflict in the Central African Republic. You have these giant coffee companies like Starbucks. And you see the Starbucks involved in these, indigenous capacity building things and these, indigenous communities in a lot of these conflict zones. And I'm curious, if there's a big coffee corporate connection, do they co-sponsor USAID stuff? Actually, I wonder. Let me just do a quick thing. Because I know that in South America, it's really interesting. Starbucks USAID. Yeah, okay, all right. Oh, really? Unavailable? Starbucks and USAID empower Colombian coffee farmers. Yeah, okay, so Colombia, this is what I was saying, in South America, it's just so funny. It's just like Coke and Pepsi. While Coke and Pepsi, 3 billion cocaine. Like, Coca-Cola produces $3 billion worth of pure cocaine every year. They ship it off to this, like, classified factory in New Jersey, in Mobland. And Coca-Cola, like, works. I mean, we saw the Pepsi coup in Chile, where the head of Pepsi, the CEO and chairman of Pepsi Cola, meets with Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, to plot to overthrow the government. So it's like Coke and Pepsi are working in the drug trade, and their whole, like, senior leadership is all over the blob. Richard Nixon was a Pepsi lawyer. Kim Cheadle, the head of DHS Secret Service when Trump got shot, came from the head of security at Pepsi. There's a million of these we've been over. And Green Mountain Coffee Roaster is big USAID money, okay? Interesting. But I have a weird feeling that the coca leaves, that, like, USAID's work in, like, cultivating cocaine, I would be interested to see if, like, the coffee companies, oh God, in Brazil, Keurig, oh no, USAID Keurig, your fucking Keurig machines are fucking, this is what I'm saying, if you're a multinational corporation, you need the blob on your side. They will create your markets. Oh, that is so funny. USAID Keurig Cooperative Coffees launched $23 million resilience fund to stabilize the coffee industry. Stabilization, huh? Because then you can control the population, because these populations will become dependent on their employers. If the employers change policy or the employers tell people who to vote for, they become captured. It's like getting them on USAID payroll. And of course, look at this. Overall, USAID is investing $20 million to combat coffee rust in Latin America. This includes a recently announced partnership with Texas A&M. With Texas A&M. You can't script this shit. Oh, Starbucks Global Coffee. Anyway, so I won't go all the way down that, but I'm really curious to see, like, what the U.S. Institute of Peace has to say about coffee and conflict, because that's just going to be juicy. I'm interested in the illegal mining stuff, because there's something similar happening in Brazil with the PCC cartel down there. So I also have flagged gold and illegal mining in Brazil, because this is going to be these same narco networks that USIP traffics through. Illegal drug trafficking and use in Libya's high and lows. Kosovo, ethnic nationalism at its territorial worst. Curious to see their ethnic, because they do all the coalition building stuff for these Rent-a-Riots and for regime change and stabilization. So I'm curious to get a glimpse into their views on, ethnic conflict. Managing NATO enlargement. Oh, this one's really good. Media as global diplomat. All about moving into, like here you go. I pulled this one from Media as Global Diplomat. This is in 2009, so Obama had just gotten into power. A new U.S. administration that understands information technologies and the power of the internet. Can you guys see this? One sec. You guys see this? This is U.S. Institute of Peace making recommendations to the State Department. The power of the internet creates new opportunities to leverage. The U.S. must catalyze public-private partnerships through interactive and social networking media. Public diplomacy in today's media climate favors a decentralized approach. that reflects fragmentation of information and builds on local partnerships that go beyond U.S. government broadcasting to foreign audiences. Media companies, NGOs, and third-party news outlets can reach certain communities that the U.S. government media cannot. So, U.S. Institute of Peace is proposing to the U.S. government, listen, with this new internet, there are populations you can't reach unless you are partnered with, unless you gobble up through partnerships with media companies, NGOs, and independent news outlets so that they're saying your message. So basically, they're calling for Operation Mockingbird on social media. NATO at 50, mob violent action in the era of digital authoritarianism. That's an interesting one to me. Nonviolent action, mob violence action, and transitions to democracy. The impact of inclusive dialogue and negotiation. Nonviolent action in Myanmar. Challenges and lessons for civil society and donors. So we're organizing riots in Myanmar. Challenges and lessons for civil society, the NGOs, the universities, the unions, and donors. Hey, Chevron, you want the petroleum in Malaysia? You a donor in there? Now, I like this. The role of women in stabilization. I'm interested in a lot of these like male, female, and identity type stuff with how they organize ethnic groups, gender groups, sexual orientation groups as part of this. The role of the U.S. ambassador, the role of women in global security, a new strategic framework for partnerships with Africa, strategic nonviolent conflict from 2002. So again, strategic mob violence, lessons from the past, ideas for the future in 2002. That one's going to be good. Sowing the seeds of mob violence action in Sudan. How do we get the fire started in Sudan? How do we sow the seeds? And again, this means mob violence. How do we sow the seeds to get it going? Afghan women. Now this one's very interesting. The urge to remember the role of memorials in social reconstruction and transitional justice. Again, transitional justice means arresting everybody from the previous administration so that they can't rise to power again. Back to that Poland-Ned thing, the Poland-Ned white paper. You have to arrest everyone from the Poland Law and Justice Party to stamp out populism, ensure democratic stability, and ensure that they can't rise to power in the next election. So what they're proposing is that memorials, statues, atrocity museums help secure public buy-in to arrest people. Do you see how sick that is? Because that's what transitional justice means. Arresting the State Department's political enemies now that we've just gained control over the Ministry of Justice in the country. And they're proposing memorials, atrocity propaganda, and studying, hey, if we build more statues about how bad, if we build a January 6th memorial, does that change our fieldwork results on people's willingness to arrest Donald Trump? If we put a big fat January 6th memorial on the National Mall, will that make it easier to achieve judicial assassination of the State Department's enemies? Using technology and nonviolent activism. USIP's work in Colombia, the heart of the drug trade. Here's another good one. What works in youth projects? What works on the impressionable minds of young people to get them to be our front lines street muscle? women in nonviolent movements, women in mobs. Yugoslavia building democratic institutions. All right, so let's get into some of these. We're going to start with this one. A special report. This is from July 2021. Digital authoritarianism and us organizing mob violence against a regime. Challenging the digital counter-revolution. I mean, just that title, Digital Authoritarianism and Nonviolent Action, Challenging the Digital Counter-Revolution. How many people would be able to disentangle what that means? This is July 2021. The Biden administration was setting up absolutely staggering volumes of its own digital authoritarianism with government censorship at that very time, and simultaneously cracking down on nonviolent action by Trump world in the form of January 6th. And of course, they have the CIA-backed Hong Kong protests here. Now, they will call anybody from a regime in power that they don't want to have power, whether that's Trump in the U.S., they'll call him a digital authoritarian, or whether that's the CCP or the Russian Federation. Digital authoritarianism does not mean digital authoritarianism. Sometimes it does. Like, I would consider China to be digital authoritarian. At the same time, I do understand why they set that up. It was because the CIA kept trying to overthrow their government, and so they closed down their society and installed a system of authoritarianism. The same way the U.S. did, by the way, as soon as Russiagate broke out, and we used the justification of hostile malign influence from Russia as a predicate to close down our internet. And have the ODNI and CIA and FBI and DHS all work with the social media companies to stop propaganda. But it is what it is. All right, I want to get into this, but I do want to have one more slice of pizza. Is it going to offend you guys if I eat a slice of pizza while I... Okay, let's get back to it. That was very satisfying. So basically, because the Hong Kong riots failed, remember, they loved Pepe in the Hong Kong riots as a rallying cry. Pepe was deemed to be racist here, but it was useful to the CIA there. Do you guys remember this? I mean, they're so two-faced. These are the riots they're talking about here, if you guys remember that, 2021. So here it is, the U.S. Institute of Peace. Nonviolent action campaign, so mob violence campaigns, in which ordinary citizens use tactics such as protests, strikes, and boycotts to put pressure on power holders, have been one of the most effective ways of semi-peacefully bringing about change in non-responsive to the State Department autocratic countries. These campaigns are increasingly shaped by emergent technologies, the internet, social media, AI, facial recognition, that offer significant benefits to non-violent action, to street violence, to street protests. Let's get the money shot. There it is. Here you go. Boom. So this is what they are trying to orchestrate. And this is a memo to their funder, the State Department, who they produce this research for to support their foreign policy goals. How do we pull off these riots more effectively using social media? Social media offers benefits to our ability to get this done. At the same time, technologies are increasingly advantaging the authoritarian regimes, the government that we're trying to topple, which uses them to suppress dissent. Oh, government censorship. Suddenly it's a bad thing now. And sustain oppressive political systems. So here's what they're basically arguing, okay? The internet and social media allow us to supercharge our Rent-a-Riots by organizing and reaching way more people to get them on the streets. But the government has AI and facial recognition. So there's an evolutionary arms race in our ability to foment riots in foreign countries and the foreign government's ability to suppress our riots. These technologies present two key challenges. They make public life more legible to the state and reduce opportunities for nonviolent action to spark defections from among regime loyalists. So the problem is, they're saying, state control over the internet reduces opportunities for our street mobs to spark defections from regime loyalists. I mean, just think about that sentence. We are trying to use mob violence to get members of the military and police and parliament to defect. In foreign countries. I mean, this is a confession that the intent is to do this. The challenges are illustrated in the ways two authoritarian regimes, China and Russia, developed tools of censorship, propaganda, and surveillance. Oh, kind of like DHS did here, FBI did here. As authoritarian regimes use technologies to an ever greater extent, it is crucial for policymakers and activists to respond to the challenges of decreased defection. Policymakers and activists. Hey, are they working together? Kind of sounds like you're confessing they're working together. The activists on the street and the policymakers here in the U.S. Do you think? Special report. Matthew Siebel is a research officer with the Program on Nonviolent Action at U.S. Institute of Peace. The author of From Dissent to Democracy. So this is the formal Program on Nonviolent Action at the U.S. Institute of Peace. U.S. Institute of Peace. They have a formal Rent-a-Riot program. Program on Nonviolent Action. Oh my gosh, Erica Chenoweth? No way. Oh, she was the one involved in everything from the TIP shit to the Tesla takedown. Another Harvard spawn. Oh, she's one of the worst. Belfer Center, CIA shit, Gene Sharp. But wait, where's the U.S. Institute of Peace? I deeply admire her, who is now the director of the Program on Nonviolent Action. No fucking way. Erica Chenoweth, who was all over using like street mobs for the Tesla takedown. Show what I mean here. Chenoweth, Tesla. Protest political violence and its alternatives with Erica Chenoweth on MSNBC. Tesla, Maria Stefan. Wait, they're like completely joined at the hip. Wait, they started the project? Tesla protests and the Musk dilemma. Erica Chenoweth started the project with the help of crowd counting consortium. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. And now Maria Stefan, I believe, is the head of at Columbia University Press, of course. Protests, boycotts, civil disobedience, breaking the law. Produce remarkable results, even in Iran, Burma, the Philippines, Palestinian territories. They detail the factors that lead Rent-a-Riots to succeed. Now, of course, she was at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Maria Stefan is a strategic planner with the U.S. Department of State. Oh my God, she was at ICNC? ICNC is who produced the fucking documentary. See this? ICNC. International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. They were also a big part of the Trump protests in 2020. This is what they call nonviolent. And this is what Maria Stefan, was strategic planner with the State Department, Georgetown University, and the Belfer Center at Harvard. But wait, was she also at the U.S. Institute of Peace Program on Nonviolent Action? U.S. Institute of Peace. Yeah, she founded and directed the U.S. Institutes of Peace Rent-a-Riot program. Oh, and now she's a part of Protect Democracy, going after Trump and Elon. Oh my God. Oh my God. Fulbright scholar. Okay, so they started early. The CIA should. Protect Democracy. Co-lead and chief organizer. Oh, that is just unbelievable. The threat. It's not just the United States. Democracies are struggling everywhere. They literally put Trump as the biggest picture right next to Putin, Xi, Orban, Maduro. What the fuck are we paying her at the U.S. Institute of Peace for? Her job, she's getting paid by U.S. taxpayers to organize riots in foreign countries, and she's simultaneously organizing them at home? We're plugging her into a giant network and giving her the money to organize mass riots to create this, while she is actively stoking that and organizing this at Tesla factories here in the United States. Do you understand? It's the same thing with Nina Jankovic. It's the same thing with Dean Jackson. It's the same thing with all these Ned puppets, all these U.S. Institute of Peace puppets. It's this point that I've been trying to drive home lately so much, which is it's not just bad enough with what they're doing and how they're misspending the money and how destructive it is to our country. It's that we have funded these people, resourced them, trained them to have 10, 20, 30-year careers in how to destabilize a country in order to overthrow its government. And they took that same money network, those same network connections, and that same set of skills to topple our own. Unfucking believable. Unbelievable. A full program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Oh my God. And the Belfer Center was directly involved in government censorship. Directly involved in government censorship of the 2020 election to censor Donald Trump. Here it is. DHS Disinformation Training, Harvard Belfer Center.
Welcome to today's webinar, Disinformation in 2020, Implications and Tools for Election Officials and the Critical Infrastructure Community. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Benjamin Scribner, and I serve as the Awareness Section Chief in the Stakeholder Engagement Division here at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA.
I'll briefly just mention.
So this is Harvard. Harvard was running the D3P, Democratic Defense Against Disinformation Partnership. The Harvard Belfer Center, that exact place that Maria Stephan was at, from the U.S. Institute of Peace program on nonviolent action, on mob violence action. And they were flagging, they were involved, they were leading the training for DHS censorship officials. And here she goes over, well, there's misinformation and disinformation, but you should flag it even if it's not disinformation because it's too time sensitive to tell the difference. Doesn't even matter if people get information wrong on purpose or not.
I think many of us will have heard the term mis and disinformation. And so we, in the playbook, we give a definition for disinformation as false information that's deliberately spread with malicious intent, and misinformation that is false information that's spread mistakenly. Our approach in giving recommendations to counter mis or disinformation is to think of them as one concept, not because they're the same, but because when an election official or a voter or others might encounter mis or disinformation, they will not be able to tell necessarily the intent or whether it's a disinformation or misinformation incident.
So I know we're giving you this big framework with all these different terms, but fuck all that. Just flag everything. The honest opinions of Americans, just flag it all. Now here's another from DHS, from the Harvard Belfer Center, working with CISA.
Make sure that you know your stakeholders and making sure that you have a plan for response, support, and alignment. And this is particularly important for disinformation because what you're going to want is to make sure that you have the ability not just to respond yourself, but you also have validators who can sort of say with credibility what the correct information is.
This is Harvard teaching CISA as they were setting up their election censorship apparatus to censor Donald Trump. 100% of the repeat information spreaders were all pro-Trump. They only flagged Trump people. There was only one other time they flagged information, but so they literally called Donald Trump the Death Star of disinformation in this program. The one time is when they flagged stuff from leftists who thought that the Trump admin might do something with the postmaster generals. And they were like, no. Like, don't worry, we got that under control. But none of them were flagged as repeat misinformation spreaders.
Because you kind of need that surround sound in order to counter.
So they're saying the government has to team up with outside validators. So while you're censoring First Amendment protected speech, you need to create a surround sound of outside validators so that it doesn't just look like it's coming from the government. Make sure you've got media allies who are going to spew your bullshit to unsuspecting voters who don't know that you're secretly partnered with them in the background.
For disinformation quickly. So the other piece of the response process, once you get kind of the wire diagrams and the team set, is the ability to actually decide, is this a big deal or not when they're looking at a particular disinformation incident? Because not all incidents are created equal, and the type of response that you have is going to depend a lot on sort of the severity level, whether it's low, medium, or high. And so this is sort of a quick...
We paid for this. Every person at DHS is funded by you and me. And the Harvard Belfer Center gets millions from the federal government. On both sides of this, we're paying for every one of the co-conspirators to have this call.
Three-question way to start assessing that severity level. Looking at, who's sharing the mis or disinformation. Is this somebody who people are going to see as a quote-unquote credible source? Is this something that voters are likely to share and see? And is it likely to kind of catch momentum?
So the government should especially flag it if it's likely to catch momentum. First Amendment protected speech.
And then how prominent is it? Is this sort of a large-scale thing, or is it relatively small? And when you look at kind of the combined answers to those three things, you can assess whether it is sort of a low, medium, or high level risk.
Risk, meaning your tweets, okay? Whether your tweets are a risk to the government. Your tweets about whether electronic voting machines are safe and reliable. Your opinion about voter fraud is a risk to the government. Just wipe your fucking ass with the First Amendment at this point. And you'll see what they say. Hi, this is prepared by the Belfer Center. Maria Stephan, who created the U.S. Institute of Peace's program on mob violence action, how to organize mobs. Yes, Maria Stephan. She's at the Belfer Center, that exact place. Belfer Center, who also hired Robbie Mook, by the way, from Hillary Clinton's campaign.
And that's going to determine exactly what you need to do. And
you'll see what it says. Activate the IRT. Risk level severity assessment threatens to significantly undermine voter confidence in electronic voting machines. That's not your fucking call to make. Get the fuck out, government. We have a First Amendment under rule of law, government. Activate the IRT. The IRT means Incident Response Team. Incident means tweet or Facebook post or YouTube video. Everything is tagged along narratives that they want to censor and then incidents as part of that narrative. Incidents are tweets or Facebook posts or YouTube videos that fall under a banned narrative. The incident response team at CISA, they're getting advised by the Harvard Belfer Center, activate the censorship squad with a high risk level, activate it with a medium risk level about whether people will believe that Joe Biden didn't win, and a low-level one, don't necessarily activate the incident response team, because the incident response team is going to be very overworked flagging all these tweets. So this is the triage system.
Playbook, we have a slightly more detailed version of this, but this is sort of the boiled down version. High means that you've got to access, launch your incident response team and
your tweet response team.
And get going very quickly.
Get going very quickly so that if someone finds a bunch of marked up ballots or someone watches people dumping in a nearby early voting drop box, we got to censor that before anybody finds out. That might be on to fraud. That could cause a big shitstorm for us. This is a conspiracy for a cover-up. Anyway, great pedigree there. Getting a sense as to why they didn't want DOJ or the federal government to have access to everything they were fucking doing at the U.S. Institute of Peace. All right, let's get back to this. About the report. So it primarily studies how do we get riots popping off in China and Russia, and why are we having such a hard time? It was funded through an interagency agreement between the U.S. Institute of Peace and USAID's Center for Democracy, Rights, and Governance, DRG. You see that? This, what we're about to read here, is a joint project between the U.S. Institute of Peace and USAID's Rent-a-Riot division, DRG. That's also the same place that did the censorship work. That is the censorship supercenter of USAID, Foundation for Freedom Online. So, for example, the USAID internal documents, this piece that I wrote a year ago on USAID and the censorship industry, the USAID Democracy, Rights, and Governance, disinformation. This is where they told everyone, go after the advertisers, defund news websites, flag everything. People might develop what they called a populist expertise. If we don't censor them, people might create their own interpretations of the world that differ from mainstream sources, reviewing and validating each other to create a populist expertise that justifies, shapes, and supports their alternative beliefs. And this impacts USAID programming, as they say. Because our own media assets are failing, some opinion leaders are casting doubt on media, which in turn impacts USAID programming. So we have to censor them as disinformation from that same place, DRG at USAID. And that's exactly who co-funded this report we're reading, which rails against government censorship. I mean, are you getting the irony? Here is USAID's government censorship primer, where they literally use the force of the government to demonetize, to regulate advertiser networks, to crack down on amplification, eliminate financial incentives. These are national governments. Commission research to map information disorder, fund news websites who agree with us, while defunding the private sector's ability to monetize. They're doing the exact thing here that they call authoritarian here. Do you get that? The same place. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, its Democracy, Rights, and Governance, the same place is calling it digital authoritarianism, when there's government censorship of their movements in China and Russia, and doing the exact same thing simultaneously in the exact same fucking sub-agency of USAID to Trump supporters in our own country. All right. So here you go, our plucky heroes in Hong Kong. In 2019, citizens of Hong Kong took to the streets over a new law. Yeah. Backed by the State Department, backed by the CIA, backed by the U.S. Institute of Peace, backed by Ned. And again, listen, I hate the Chinese government. If they weren't doing this to us, maybe this would hit different. But the fact is this now is in control of our own politics. And they've lumped us in. As we saw, they've quite literally lumped us in to the picture. They've lumped us in. Here's us. And here are the two subjects of the report. So that's why you have to understand when I say this about, yeah, Hong Kong was a CIA-backed Rent-a-Riot operation in 2019 and 2020. It was. And the state cracked down on it. And they were unhappy about that, even though they were totally fine about cracking down on January 6 people for much less violence than the Hong Kong folks did. Now, here's how the U.S. Institute of Peace just glazes the Hong Kong folks. Over the following months, the protests escalated to demanding greater democracy and even secession of Hong Kong from China. Wow, I can't imagine that the U.S. government and the U.K. government might be behind the secession of Hong Kong from China. I mean, imagine what would happen if, like, Trump supporters were in the streets in a secessionist movement to get Texas and Florida to peel off from the United States. You think the Joe Biden federal government would just sit there and take it? How fast do you think the fucking Marines would swoop in? The protests attracted mass participation, and their youthful, creative tactics. Following martial arts star Bruce Lee's advice to be water, inspired movements around the world. Yeah. I'm sure they had no direction, like from the documentary we just watched from the U.S. State Department, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy. Tear gas, batons, arrests, mass firings, yet perhaps the most critical front in the war between pro-democracy protesters. I thought you just said they were secessionists. They were nationalist. No, but they're useful to us. And the mainland government was fought online. That's where the main front line of the war was, on the internet. Hong Kong has long enjoyed more flexible rules about freedom of expression than mainland China. It's ostensibly outside Beijing's great firewall of censorship. Suddenly they hate censorship, right? When you want to overthrow a government, They hate censorship. When they want to keep their government in power, they fucking love it. Beijing, however, deployed an increasingly sophisticated set of repressive tools, including facial recognition cameras, invasive online surveillance, and draconian security law to stifle the movement. Activists fought back, coordinating resistance through encrypted messaging apps such as Signal and Telegram, posting videos online about how to fool facial recognition cameras. Don't you love that? As they install mandatory facial recognition at every U.S. airport, we have to go after the extremists. They condemn other countries for doing it. Why? Because those countries which are working in tandem with U.S. intelligence, as fucking evidence, by the way, just from the fact that this memo exists sponsored by the U.S. government. But no, facial recognition, bad when they do it, good when we do it. In early 2021, demonstrations broke out across Russia. Demonstrations, huh? Following the arrest of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, with protesters braving sub-zero temperatures to express their opposition to Vladimir Putin. The protests were fueled by a YouTube video posted by Navalny's party, presenting evidence that Putin illicitly owned a huge estate on the Black Sea. Do you guys remember this? And then they gave, what, an Oscar to Navalny, the documentary? I mean, the fucking CIA op between Yale Jackson School, Maurice Greenberg School, riot-trained, literally Yale-trained, Rent-a-Riot organizer Navalny, in league with Bellingcat. I'm sure those were totally organic. I'm sure the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Institute of Peace's network within Russia weren't activated in tandem with the release of the YouTube video. I'm sure that wasn't astroturfed like 100%. Just like Pussy Riot, right? Pussy Riot, Russia, Ned, USAID. Yeah, the National Endowment for Democracy sponsoring fucking Pussy Riot inside of Russia. Protest Street Rocks sponsored by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. And here's the kind of stuff they were doing to try to gin up riots. They did an I Can't Breathe one for BLM. Putin will teach you how to love. Police state. Look at that. You see they have Trump shaking hands with Putin right here. Some of these are insane, by the way. Like,
make America so great again.
Donald Trump made his first visit to Washington.
People have been maced, and the police look like they're blocking them in.
No more.
Where you belong? Do you want to stay in the kitchen? Is that where you belong?
This is what the National Endowment for Democracy was using to try to spark left-wing street protests against Putin from 2011 to 2013. You ever see Pussy Riot at the U.S. State Department? Yeah, like, there you go. Here's Pussy Riot with Nadia, the lead singer, with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. There it is, guys. Here you go. Brought to you by the Tony Blinken State Department. Totally organic. State Department, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy. Protest rock. After a decade, this is in 2013, of Putin's authoritarian rule, in which civil society seems to be comatose, a new protest movement is growing inside of Russia. Infuriated by election fraud. Oh, but didn't you say it yourself, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, that you need to activate incident response teams to make sure that there's no lack of voter confidence and the integrity of the electoral processes? I thought believing in electoral fraud is effectively a crime against the state. That's why you have DHS to censor anyone who posts anything that might suggest that there's voter fraud. But if the state censors claims about electoral fraud in Russia, you call that a fucking authoritarian rule. So now, the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA's Harry Scrotum, fights back by means of music, poetry, multimedia, and daring art performances. These are daring art performances. Isn't that amazing? Oh my God. Christopher Walker from Ned, the worst. The guy who initially was proposing censoring the internet at Ned after Trump won the 2016 election. You can't script this shit. The very people who were saying, oh, Russia's censoring Pussy Riot, were the first people to call for government censorship against the Trump movement. Okay, let's get back to this. 2 challenges. Censorship. Yeah. The very people, they were setting up the U.S. censorship apparatus as they were complaining about this. Video games, implications. The internet has transformed how Chinese citizens interact with the state. Online forums are far more critical than traditional media, and virtual campaigns have forced the CCP to adjust policies on several prominent occasions. For decades, protests in China have numbered in the tens of thousands annually on issues of taxation, land seizure, labor abuse, and others. These movements have been enhanced by internet activism, which has empowered Chinese civil society to forge online communities, voice grievances, and draw national attention to local governance failures. However, it's been better for the CCP. So saying, listen, we can inflate a spark. There are protests in China that number tens of thousands on various issues. But we haven't been able to fully topple the government with these riots. The problem is this, like, the state is really heavy-handed. They really crack down on these people, and it scares them. Just like they were around January 6th, because of 4 hours of protests on one day. So they say, moreover, opportunities to provoke regime defections. So again, the explicit goal is to topple the government. This is our government paying for this to be written, paying the salaries of everyone writing this, about how to provoke an internal coup within a foreign country and provoke regime defections. I mean, imagine reading something from like the Chinese government about how, like, just published right out in the open about how to provoke regime defections within the Trump administration and organize Black Lives Matter protests to destabilize the Trump administration. That's like what this is. And again, maybe there's a role for that if they didn't also call us the same thing. So you just have to know your enemy is the point. I'm not trying to glaze the CCP. I think the CCP sucks, but these are the tactics. They talk about the problem of this thing called the dishonest persons blacklist. There was no file, no police warrant, no advance notification. They just cut me off from the things I was once entitled to. What's really scary is there's nothing you can do about it. You can report to no one. You're stuck in the middle of nowhere. Oh, you mean like what the Canadian government did to the truckers when they just cut off their bank account? No file, no police warrant, no advance notification. You're just cut off. Do we need to organize CIA riots inside of Canada to topple that digital authoritarian government? Whereas online activism has fueled mass uprisings in other autocracies, China has not experienced any regime-threatening mobilization since 1989, the Tiananmen Square in June. Protests in the country are reformist and occur exclusively around non-ideological concerns. Oh, darn, the CIA is saying here. They're protesting about the things that are bothering them in their community, like taxation or labor. They're not directly calling to take down the government. How can we convert that? The regime keeps a tight grip on media and has imprisoned a number of prominent human rights activists. The resulting chilling effect is increasingly leading democracy-minded Chinese citizens to self-censor. Oh, the same thing you tried to induce here in the United States against us. Fear of censorship is on full display in Hong Kong. Oh, well, you guys should know something about that. You set it up here in the United States. In these circumstances, the likelihood of a large-scale mob violence campaign triggering significant regime defections seems slim. Yet, even as organized dissent is suffocated, many Chinese appear less fearful of the regime. Many are blissfully ignorant of the scope of the repression, enjoy virtual life within the Great Firewall's subtle constraints, and appreciate the convenience of a network society under the CCP's watchful eye. In other words, China's digital autocrats are having their cake and eating it too. And that's kind of like what the Biden regime was having. They were choking the ever-loving shit out of Trump supporters. And a lot of the country was like kind of blissfully unaware. They were just like watching their Twitch streamers, watching their sports, until it got so bad that they arrested Trump, hit him with 91 felonies, and then shot him in the face. At that point, it was very difficult to be blissfully ignorant of what was going on. All right, so you love this stuff. Look at this. Disinformation in Russia. So saying Russia does not have as sophisticated a censorship mechanism as China does. To compensate, they've leaned into disinformation campaigns. As in China, the Kremlin pays pro-regime youth groups and bribes influential bloggers. Oh, we're calling those bribes now. To cheerlead for the regime. Huh, we're calling those bribes, huh? Hey, is that a bribe? What was your language there, U.S. Institute of Peace? Let me get the language right. Let me just make sure I got this in HD 4K here. The Kremlin bribes influential bloggers to cheerlead for the regime. Is that why NATO is paying TikTokers and Instagrammers? Are you bribing influential bloggers? Is that what you're doing there? How about Ned's Center for International Media Assistance? An entire Ned program to pay the media to cheerlead for your fucking regime. Every accusation by the blob is a confession. Look at this. The hashtags, yeah. Recommendations for policymakers and activists. External actors should increase support for free spaces based on traditional institutional structures. They said the internet was really good for us in the beginning. It really helped in Yugoslavia. It really helped in the Orange Revolution. It really helped during the Arab Spring. But we can't ignore traditional media. Donors would do well to shift their attention towards the day-to-day networks of work, recreation, and faith that build underlying civic capacity for future mobilization without relying on increasingly legible online space. So saying, work with the churches, work with the labor unions, work with the entertainment industry. Don't just focus on online. Isn't that amazing? If you want to get people to riot in the streets in the future mobilization. Activists should preemptively build, so these are rioters. You're talking about street rioters. Talking about these people. From the CIA, dear rioters, here's what you should do. Build offline redundancy. Don't abandon the digital space, but you have to build redundancy in offline networks. For example, in Ethiopia, young activists in the 2015-2016 protests. This is how you immediately know that this was a CIA-backed protest. Were forced to adapt the government's control of the internet by building in-person networks in prison after mass arrests. Oh, great. So the CIA's advice to their assets on the ground who get arrested is form gangs in prison. Makes you wonder about our own prison gangs, huh? Both donors and activists. So again, the donors, the multinational corporations, billionaire financiers, the donor drafter class, and the donor drafter class on top of the government, and the activist street muscle below the government should both facilitate training in advanced digital security, such as VPNs, end-to-end encryption. Oh, the same stuff that you want to break in Europe to stop populism. The same stuff trying to get rid of encryption in the UK because Tommy Robinson supporters were using it. No bottom to their corruption. Be creative. Build networks with scientists and engineers. Infiltrate everywhere. All right, we'll just end with, what am I feeling right now? All right. Thank you all for joining me. Good night. Godspeed. I will see you on the internet.